The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative
on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome. You are entering the Stone Zone. Well, back on March 18th and 20th, at the direction of President Donald Trump, the National Archives released the entire JFK assassination records collection from the National Archives. Having now read all 77,000 pages, and yes, I had to burn the midnight oil to do that, I can tell you definitively, having written a New York Times best-selling book on the Kennedy assassination, that these records are woefully incomplete. I don't blame President Trump, nor do I blame National Director of Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, because they adhered exactly to the president's order. The problem is that the National Archives JFK assassination records collection is in itself incomplete, meaning that there are thousands of documents still at the FBI, the CIA, the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the IRS, the U.S. Army Intelligence, and elsewhere that were not included. It's interesting because we know that there are audios, videos, and documents that were actually reviewed by the Assassination Records Review Board, which was the last time the government set up a review process for these documents back in the late 90s. Nothing that I have seen, for example, addresses the fact that the House Special Select Committee on Assassinations that was appointed in the late 70s conducted an exhaustive investigation and concluded that organized crime had played a central role in John Kennedy's murder. Yet none of the documents released by the National Archives address the question of the involvement of organized crime. Nothing that I have seen in these documents changed my fundamental theme of my own book and my own research, which tells me that there was a plot that involved Lyndon Baines Johnson at the helm, the Central Intelligence Agency, organized crime, and Big Texas Oil to kill John F. Kennedy. Each one of those entities had their own individual motive. Let's speak, first of all, to the motive of Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson was under investigation in two of the largest corruption scandals of the 1960s. First, there was the Bobby Baker scandal. Baker was the Secretary of the U.S. Senate. He was Lyndon Johnson's right-hand man, some would say his bag man. No major appropriation went through the Senate in the 1950s when Johnson was the majority leader without a payoff to Bobby Baker. Baker would later write a colorful biography that was serialized by Politico. If you needed a prostitute or you needed a payoff, or if you needed a little assistance, well, Baker was the man in the U.S. Senate to see. Johnson maintained a suite at the old Sheraton Carlton Hotel in Washington, D.C., where prostitutes, both men and women, entertained senators and congressmen. Unbeknownst to them, this was outfitted with a two-way mirror and a camera. All of this, again, in Baker's memoir. This is why, as a Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon Johnson didn't lose many votes on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Johnson was also under investigation in the Billy Sol Estes investigation. Sol Estes was a flamboyant Texas wheeler dealer, and he had received multiple million-dollar contracts from the Agricultural Department regarding fertilizer tanks that, well, didn't really exist. But he was kicking back to LBJ. In fact, the U.S. Senate hearings run by John J. Williams, the senator from Delaware, opened on the Senate, in the Senate on November 22nd, 1963. Throughout that day, Johnson was in constant telephone contact with his Confederates back in Washington to see whether his name had come up. So Lyndon Johnson knew that Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy had begun telling people that Johnson would be dropped from the 1964 ticket, and he would be replaced. In fact, John Kennedy, according to the memoirs of his personal secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, had told Lincoln that Governor Terry Sanford of North Carolina was the likely choice to replace LBJ. So Johnson was a man staring into the abyss. Now, it's interesting that Robert Caro, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, whose book is far more famous than mine, my book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ, he won a Pulitzer Prize for a 3-volume biography of LBJ, but somehow Billy Sol Estes is never mentioned once in that 3-volume biography. It was Lyndon Johnson who convinced John Kennedy to go to Texas. The purpose of that trip was to bind up divisions in the Democrat Party, that between the progressive wing headed by Senator Ralph Yarborough and the Bourbon or more conservative wing headed by Governor John Connally. Connally had formerly served as Johnson's chief of staff in the U.S. Senate and in the Senate Majority Leader's office until returning to Texas to run for governor. It never made any sense as to why the motorcade went through the city of Dallas, because on that fateful day, John F. Kennedy was driving from the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport to the Merchandise Mart, both of them outside the city limits of Dallas, and the easiest way to get between them was on the freeway, where the car, of course, would never have come to a full stop. If you go to the autobiography of Jerry Bruno, who was the chief advance man for President John F. Kennedy, Bruno records that he objected to the motorcade route that had the president's limo and motorcade going through Dealey Plaza, where the car was required to come to a full stop at a stop sign, and that Governor Connally insisted that they would take that route or the entire trip to Texas would be canceled. We also know, because of the memoirs of Jacqueline Kennedy, that the night before the assassination, Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, went to JFK's suite at the Fort Worth Hotel and argued that they should change the motorcade entourage to put his hated rival, Senator Ralph Yarborough, in Kennedy's car, the so-called death car, and move Governor Connally to the vice president's limousine, which would normally be only one car length away from the presidential limousine, with a carload of Secret Service agents between them. But the president said that would undo the whole purpose of the trip, which was for Kennedy to be seen with Connally. Johnson did not take this news well, storming out of the room after pitching a fit. In fact, Jacqueline Kennedy said to her husband, "What was that all about?" And JFK said, "Well, that was just Lyndon being Lyndon." Now, I have demonstrated in my book that the most likely shooter from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building is a man named Malcolm Mac Wallace. Wallace has a clear connection to Lyndon Johnson. In 1951, Malcolm Wallace, who was a Marine Corps veteran but a much more highly rated shot than Lee Harvey Oswald, was convicted of first-degree murder. Wallace was convicted of first-degree murder. He was represented at trial by John Cofer, who was Lyndon Baines Johnson's personal attorney, and he is the only man in the history of Texas jurisprudence to be convicted of murder, but to get off with probation. So we know that the Dallas police found multiple fingerprints for Wallace, both on the window encasement and in the cardboard boxes that fashioned the so-called crow's nest from which the shooter from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository shot. no fewer than 6 people see a man who meets the physical description of Wallace in the window, meaning of medium build, balding, and every one of them says wearing glasses. That is most certainly not a description of Lee Harvey Oswald. Now add to the fact that the Dallas police conduct a paraffin test on Oswald, and they see that he has no powder burns on his chest or his arms or his cheeks or his hands. So if he had indeed shot a leaky $26 World War II vintage Carcano rifle, he would have had powder burns all over him. He had none. Then there is the idea that that Oswald had time to get off 3 shots, all from behind, to hit John Kennedy and kill him, hide the rifle, and then run down 4 flights of stairs from the 6th floor to the 2nd floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. The problem with that is that another Texas School Book Depository employee, Victoria Adams, was on the staircase between the 4th and 2nd floor at that exact time, 90 seconds after Kennedy was shot, and she neither saw nor heard Lee Harvey Oswald, and a Dallas police officer records that he saw Wallace in the lunchroom on the 2nd floor, calmly eating an apple as part of his lunch and drinking a Coke, only 90 seconds after the final shot hit Kennedy. So I stick to my theory that Johnson had the greatest single motive, means, and opportunity to kill John Kennedy. But I'm not arguing that, by the way, that he did it alone. The Central Intelligence Agency plays a very key role in the murder of John F. Kennedy. They had 2 motives. First of all, there was the botched Bay of Pigs operation. For years, we were told that the Bay of Pigs failed because the men storming the beaches in a CIA laid-out plan were cut to ribbons due to any lack of air support. But the truth is that the plan that was approved by John F. Kennedy, the CIA plan, included 29 Panamanian flagged bombers that were supposed to be piloted by Cuban pilots. That was canceled by the CIA the day before the invasion. This was a fiasco for which John F. Kennedy took full responsibility. When we come back, I will tell you about the mob's motive, but then I want to focus on the released documents regarding Senator Robert F. Kennedy. They came out on April 18th. There's only 10,000 of them. I've also now had the opportunity to read those, but we have just learned that there are 50,000 pages that we have not seen yet, that have not been released. You're tuned in to the Stone Zone. I'm Roger Stone. Whatever you do, don't touch that dial, because we'll be right back.
The Stone Zone
on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative
on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And we're back. We're deconstructing the 77,000 documents released by the National Archives pertaining to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. But as I was indicating, the Central Intelligence Agency in this latest dump, at a minimum, demonstrates that they knew far more about Lee Harvey Oswald than they ever admitted before. In addition to the Bay of Pigs fiasco, for which the CIA blamed Kennedy, for which Kennedy blamed the CIA, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, we've all heard the story. There's actually a movie about it, 14 Days, about how brave Robert and John Kennedy faced down Nikita Khrushchev, who then withdrew the missiles from Cuba. The problem with that, of course, is that it's not true. the Pentagon and our intelligence agencies knew in real time that the Kennedys made a secret deal that would be classified for 40 years to remove our missiles from Turkey and Italy, NATO missiles, changing the balance of power in Europe in return for a pledge from Khrushchev to remove the missiles from Cuba that included no on-site inspections. Perhaps this is why John F. Kennedy said that he would smash the CIA into a million pieces. Now we have the release of the documents regarding the murder of Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Kennedy was murdered in the Ambassador Hotel on the night of his greatest triumph. That was his victory in the California Democrat primary for president in 1968. I argue that Senator Kennedy probably sealed his fate speaking to a student audience just days before in California. When asked if he was elected president, he had always given lip service to the Warren Commission conclusions, but he did say for the first time that if elected president, he would reopen the investigation into his brother's death. Here's the problem. Sirhan, the man convicted of killing Robert Kennedy, was always in front of him. He was also shooting wildly. He got off 8 shots, but all 8 shots are accounted for, and none of those 8 shots hit Robert F. Kennedy. According to the L.A. County coroner, Thomas Noguchi, Robert F. Kennedy was shot from behind at the left rear of his skull at point-blank range. That means with the barrel of the gun right up against his head. I believe that the killer is Thane Eugene Cesar, a Filipino who was a security guard hired by the Ambassador Hotel the week before the Kennedy murder, and who abruptly quit his job and returned to the Philippines. By the way, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. agrees with me, said so in a terrific interview with Mike Tyson, of all people. It really is spellbinding. I wish you could see it, but it was posted on YouTube where it was very quickly taken down. I guess it's another example of censorship. Don't go away. You're in the Stone Zone. We're going to talk about saving the animals when we come back. So whatever you do, please don't touch that dial.
The Stone Zone
on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And we're back in the Stone Zone. Look, anybody who knows me or my wife knows that we are animal lovers. In the course of our marriage, we have 9 Yorkshire Terriers and 1 3-legged Wheaton Terrier who we got on the side of the road. He'd been mangled by a car. We tried to save his leg, but it had to be amputated. It's amazing how he got along incredibly well on 3 legs, and he lived a long and full life as an adoptee in our household. Some of the work that I'm proudest of during President Donald Trump's first term was when I worked as a volunteer with the White Coat Waste Project to end the inhumane and horrific so-called scientific taxpayer-funded experiments on dogs, cats, and other primates. We made great strides during the first Trump presidency, and the president zeroed out funding for these horrific, unscientific, but chilling experiments. But now it appears that some of it is back. Joining me now, Justin Goodman, Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Public Policy at the White Coast Waste Project. For more than 15 years, Justin has led winning grassroots and lobbying campaigns to expose and end the wasteful and cruel taxpayer-funded experiments on dogs, cats, primates, and other animals. Justin, welcome back into the Stone Zone.
Roger, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for all your great advocacy for animals suffering in government labs. We couldn't do this stuff without you.
Well, I really much appreciate your work, and I was happy to volunteer, and I want to bring public attention to the issue again yet today. while we did make great strides in the first Trump administration, and even in this administration, so for example, the Environmental Protection Agency, now run by former New York Congressman Lee Zeldin, announced that it would get the agency back on track and consistent with the 2019 Trump plan to eliminate animal testing. Other places in the government, it seems that this is not happening. First, let's talk about EPA. This, to me, is very good news.
Yeah, absolutely, Roger. As you know, you were one of the people who helped get this historic policy in place back in 2019. Andrew Wheeler, then the head of the EPA under Trump 45, announced a historic plan, first in the history of the government, that they were going to completely eliminate all animal testing by 2035, and they were going to make a 30% reduction by 2025, which is this year. Andrew Wheeler and President Trump put the agency on track in 2019 to accomplish that. Unfortunately, right after Andrew Wheeler and President Trump left the White House in 2021, the Biden administration, due to pressure from scientists inside the agency as well as environmental groups, got the Biden administration to kill the Trump plan to end animal testing at the EPA. The environmental groups that were pressuring the Biden administration got them to do that, to remove the deadlines to end animal testing, and said they needed to do it in the name of environmental justice, that we needed to do. Not only did they want to completely eliminate Trump's plan, but they wanted the EPA to do more animal testing, again, in the name of environmental justice and other woke priorities. Like there's one example during the Biden administration where the EPA was shooting off handguns and rifles and forcing animals to breathe the firearms emissions for gun control experiments. In other testing, they were putting rats in cages, feeding them unhealthy diets, and then heating up the cages to mimic climate change, allegedly, and then pump smoke, wildfire smoke, into the cages to mimic wildfires and climate change interacting on people who eat crappy food. So the mind reels, but the Trump administration, one of the first things they did, and you and I have been advocating this since the beginning of the year, Lee Zeldin's EPA committed to getting the agency back on track to eliminating animal testing. So that's great news. The EPA kills thousands and thousands of animals a year in these experiments, rabbits, dogs, other animals. And this is going to save a lot of tax money and a lot of animals. So that's good news for everyone. But like you said, it hasn't been all sunshine and rainbows, unfortunately, over the first 100 days of the administration.
Yeah, I am still haunted by these images. I'm sure people have seen them. Where under Dr. Fauci, they would take beagles, they would encase the beagles' heads in this enclosure, and then they would pump in sand fleas that would literally eat the flesh on the faces and heads of these beagles. Can you explain to me what the scientific value of that might be?
Yeah, of course, Roger. So, yeah, you're referring to our landmark investigation in 2021 after we uncovered Fauci's funding for the Wuhan lab, and we just celebrated the 5-year anniversary of that investigation, and President Trump famously going on TV during the coronavirus briefing in late April and saying, this is tremendous waste, I'm going to cut that grant. And right there on the spot on TV, he cut the funding for the Wuhan lab after our investigation. Thrilled about that. The next big Fauci scandal that we uncovered was in 2021, where we uncovered these photographs of beagle puppies who'd been drugged and their head placed in these mesh cages and they allowed biting flies to eat them alive. And that was a project going on in a foreign country in Tunisia with U.S. taxpayer dollars, and they were doing vaccine experiments on those dogs over there. And unfortunately, Fauci, even though he's gone from government, and I know you've talked about this on the show, we've talked about it on the show, you've written about it on your website. Unfortunately, even though he's gone from government, a lot of the animal testing that he signed off on, put into motion, and was personally involved in some cases, has continued under the new administration, under Trump, despite obviously the president and Secretary Kennedy's commitment to wipe Anthony Fauci's fingerprints from the federal government and fix the broken NIH that he left. So again, there's good news at the EPA, but we are troubled by some of the things we're seeing at the NIH under its current director, Jay Bhattacharya.
Yeah, I saw these new records publicized by my friend Laura Loomer. but released by White Coat Waste that reveals that the National Institute of Health has extended funding for septic shock experiments where beagles are pumped with bacteria and then slowly killed without pain relief. This is actually happening inside the NIH headquarters where the new director works, and they've renewed a $322,000 grant to Moderna billionaire Robert Langer's company to abuse dogs in weight loss drug tests. Elon Musk himself said online that this needs to be investigated and stopped. I could not agree more. Now you add to the fact that the NIH and the Pentagon are continuing to pay a lab in China, which tortures, I'm told, 300 beagles per week. I really don't believe the president knows about any of this. That's my own belief, because he too is an animal lover. And I see where you have appealed to the Secretary of Defense as well as to the president to end this horrific, cruel, weird experiments on dogs, cats, and other animals.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been advocating since the end of last year. I mean, since the president was reelected in November, we've been putting these issues at the top of our priority list for the new administration to cut funding for dog and cat testing across these agencies. Like you said, we're still finding evidence not only of contracts, Biden-era contracts, Fauci contracts and grants that these guys literally signed off on and supported, getting renewed now under the new NIH leadership. But a lot of the projects have just continued. But Fauci established and has been funding an island off of South Carolina where there's 3,000 monkeys being held captive, and then a few hundred are shipped off the island every year for virus experiments in NIH labs. The NIH just renewed the funding for that. Obviously, you mentioned the other funding they've renewed. They've cut some grants, but renewed some funding for these crazy transgender animal experiments that we uncovered. And I think you're right. I think that Pete, Secretary Hedges, obviously doesn't know about this stuff. I think now that Elon Musk weighed in today, both about the NIH and DOD animal testing, saying that DOJ needs to investigate, I think that the Secretary will take swift and decisive action to make sure dogs aren't being tortured in China with our tax dollars. I mean, that's sick and dangerous and presents national security risks, obviously. But I don't think he wants it happening here either. And I think the president, now that folks like you and Laura Loomer and Elon are getting involved and really making noise and speaking up about the fact that these Biden-era Fauci holdovers who are now in the NIH are actually signing off on continuing some of these wasteful and cruel and ridiculous projects that are costing taxpayers billions of dollars a year. So, Roger, you know better than I do about how to clean out the government, and I think we really do need to clean house at NIH. There are people who have been there Obama years, Biden years, who are still running the show, signing off on these grants and keeping a lot of this waste going and keeping it alive. And we really need folks in there who are willing to make what most people consider easy decisions. We shouldn't be funding experiments in China on animals. We shouldn't be torturing cats and dogs with taxpayer dollars. These are things that people across the political spectrum can agree on. But there's deep state losers inside the NIH who want to keep this stuff going and keep their jobs, and we need to get them out of there.
So, Justin, if people want to help in what I think is a really noble crusade, where can they go online and support your important work?
Thank you for that opportunity, Roger. I would love if folks visited whitecoatwaste.org. That's our website, and to follow us on social and see all the activity today with you and Laura Loomer and Elon Musk on X, on all social media platforms at White Coat Waste.
I was interested to see that this congressman from Michigan, Sri Thinadar, who sponsored a resolution to impeach President Donald Trump, not only does he have an $800,000 campaign debt, so I think his impeachment resolution is really more about raising money for his reelection, but in his prior career, he actually ran a laboratory where they experimented on animals, and essentially he abandoned 118 beagles, as I understand it, leaving them abandoned without food or water. This boggles the mind.
Roger. This is back in 2010. I actually was involved in this case. I was working at PETA back then. I hadn't been there for a long time. I've been at White Coat nearly a decade, but I was back there, and the veterinarian from that laboratory called me, and he was frantic, and he said that we just got word that they're shutting the lab down, and the owner, who we now know is at the time he was just the owner of the lab, and now we know he's a congressman now, Sri Thanadar from Michigan, had left the animals there to die and washed his hands of the whole situation after the bank took over. So this veterinarian wanted to save those animals. He called me and said, "What can you do?" And unfortunately, PETA at the time told me that they didn't want to do anything. They were not going to get involved. But I have lots of friends in the animal rescue space and was able to reach out to folks who do dog and cat rescue and who rescue primates and bring them to sanctuaries. And they were able to save over 170 beagles and monkeys who were locked in Thanadar's lab at the time and were being left for dead. And this type of laboratory, obviously his is shut down. These laboratories exist because animal testing is big business. The government spends $20 billion a year on animal testing of taxpayers' money. And not only do we spend taxpayers' money on animal testing, the FDA and other agencies have forced companies to conduct animal testing against their will for new products, even though it's incredibly wasteful and unnecessary and very expensive. And that's how labs like Thanadar's exist, because of government funding and also government mandates on private industry. So we've seen some good movement, obviously, like we said, at the EPA with getting rid of some of these animal testing requirements for testing pesticides on dogs, for example, is something the EPA is currently doing, but hopefully will end soon. And the FDA, Marty Makary at the FDA, the commissioner, announced a big plan a couple of weeks ago, a 10-page, I think it was like a 10-page plan they released outlining their priorities for reducing animal testing. So that's all steps in the right direction. NIH has cut some testing. DOJ has cut some testing at the NIH, but the NIH has not yet made any sweeping announcement about cutting animal testing. And in fact, the only thing they have released is a plan for more spending and more bureaucracy that's not going to save animals. So we're really trying to put some pressure on the NIH to do the right thing and end these programs that Fauci kept alive for 40 years and finally put them in the grave where they belong.
So other than going to your website, let's give our folks the website one more time.
It is whitecoatwaste.org, and then on social media at whitecoatwaste on all the platforms.
All right. And if they want to take additional action, what would you recommend? Should they write the president? Should they write who should they write to?
I think go on social media and tag the president, tag the head of the NIH, Jay Bhattacharya, at NIH, at POTUS, and just let these people know you want to see taxpayer funding cut for government animal experiments.
All right. I want to thank our guest, Justin Goodman. He is the Senior Vice President of Advocacy and Public Policy for the White Coat Waste Project. Please, folks, give us a hand here. Help us save the animals. You've been listening to The Stone Zone. Whatever you do, don't touch that dial, because we'll be right back. Many thanks to our guest. Justin, thanks for joining us.
The Stone Zone
on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative
on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And you're back in the zone. President Donald Trump has now signed an executive order ending the taxpayer subsidization of National Public Radio and the public broadcasting system, which were both receiving millions of dollars from taxpayers to spread radical, woke propaganda disguised as news. Only days ago, National Public Radio went public with a report that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's resignation was imminent. There was only one problem. The report was false. The White House published multiple examples of National Public Radio and PBS's actions that led to this decision. The NPR issued an editor's note warning the Declaration of Independence is a document that contains offensive language, for example. NPR apologized for calling illegal immigrants illegal. They prefer undocumented. NPR published a story claiming that young men who abstain from masturbating to pornography may need to see a doctor or a therapist. These are your tax dollars paying for this. At least they were. National Public Radio featured a Valentine's Day story about queer animals in which it was suggested that some deer are non-binary, and the make-believe clownfish in Finding Nemo could have been better off as a female. I wish I was kidding about this stuff, folks, but I'm not. PBS devoted a panel on what it means to be woke and the dangers of white privilege. NPR routinely promotes the chemical and surgical mutilation of children as so-called gender-affirming care without mentioning the irreversible damage caused by these very procedures. In 2021, PBS aired a children's program that featured a drag queen named Little Miss Hot Mess. NPR also educated the nation on the whole community of queer, gender, dinosaur enthusiasts, and trans ceratops. A PBS White House correspondent characterized President Trump's patriotic 2020 Mount Rushmore speech as a love letter to white resentment that promoted a myth about America. NPR also assigned 3 reporters to investigate how the thumbs up emoji is racist. Through my whole life, a thumbs up meant yes. It's just like the okay sign. No, that's not a white supremacist hand sign. It means okay. It has my entire life. National Public Radio also suggested doorway sizes are based on latent fat phobia. Didn't even know there was such a word. PBS also suggested in an entire movie celebrating a transgender teenager's so-called changing gender identity. National Public Radio absurdly claimed that limited scientific evidence of physical advantage exists between male and female athletes. Back in 2023, PBS's Washington Week Roundtable covered up Joe Biden's clear mental decline, with far-left journalist Jeffrey Goldberg claiming that Biden was actually quite acute. Reminds me, just the other day, the White House Correspondents Association gave an award to a reporter from Axios because he had the courage to report on Joe Biden's decline, his mental decline. Everybody in that room, everyone in the banquet knew about it, but only this one guy had the courage to write about it. It's extraordinary. Look, I believe in free speech. I believe you can say whatever you wish, but I don't believe that our tax dollars should be paying for this kind of quote unquote journalism. And that's the way I see it, because it's the stone cold truth. I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of Americans don't want their tax dollars paying for garbage like this as well. Thanks for joining us today in the Stone Zone. Until we meet again, well, God bless you and Godspeed.
Thanks for listening to The Stone Zone with Roger Stone. You can hear The Stone Zone with Roger Stone weeknights at 8 on 77 WABC. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode, so you never have to wonder.
What the heck is going on here?